It tends to happen where I feel myself in the flow of contemplation, or just a flow, a stream of conscious contemplation. And as soon as I sort of quote unquote disrupt myself to uh, start recording, or perhaps divert myself, I divert that flow. It's a bit challenging to feel immersed in that same energy. Um, so I am consciously intending to lean into it again. In reading this article, I forgot this past weekend that the River Fest was going on. And in reading this article, there's a couple of things that come through, or the biggest, what stands out to me the most is the undercurrent that I feel in this. There is an appreciation for highlighting and showcasing local artisans, local creators, and there is an excitement in that. Yet there is still this undercurrent that feels like something isn't quite there, like something is missing, something doesn't feel like it's quite activated, so to speak. See, now I'm just gonna like pause here for a minute, because I feel like I'm trying here and it's not that flow. And it's just, I want to feel more excited about this. I want to feel more of a sort of genuine gravitation, a genuine desire to, perhaps rather than genuine, it's an effortless, yes, I want to go and explore these vendors. I want to go and explore the creations that are being offered, being showcased, being highlighted. I want to engage. I want to participate. I want to show up. And yet there is this aspect of the experience when I lean into it, when I feel into it, there's this aspect of the experience that feels forced in a way. It, it kind of feels discordant with my sense of integrity, and I'm not really quite sure how else to put it. And whether this is conscious or not, there is a push to, there's like desperation. There's this desperation to grab onto something, to hold on to something, to feel a sense of community, to feel a sense of hope, of okayness. I don't know. I'm just getting this I'm just going to say it the way it is, and it's coming through. And if I want to edit it the way, if I want to edit this out, future self. I don't even know that I'm going to keep this recording, quite honestly, because it feels like it's so all over the place at this point, and I haven't even really articulated much. But there is a sense I'm getting, as much as there is appreciation for highlighting local creators and local just artisans, artists, just local community members, as much as there is a sense of appreciation for that and a desire to explore and participate, more than that, this sense of facade. It feels hollow. It feels very sort of surface level, and I don't mean that in a critical, judgmental way. It feels desperate. That sounds extreme, and to a degree it feels extreme in phrasing it that way, but it's that sense of desperation for perhaps a feeling of normalcy, desperation for a sense of togetherness, desperation for a sense of creativity and joy, for acknowledgement and belonging and gratitude, support. I suppose in a way it feels, or what's standing out to me as a facade, the facade almost feels like the, not necessarily like the publication, the, not the advertisement, but the, like the media coverage of it. And I'm not saying that in a sense of like the substance of what's being reported on, but it's how it's being promoted by the leaders, being promoted by the leadership. And again, that's not to say that there is intentionality to promote a facade per se. This kind of goes towards what I was speaking about, or what was coming through in terms of that shadowy teacher energy, where there is this very subtle, now I kind of just lost my train of thought. I don't know. I feel like what I was going for here perhaps had to do with how the in this shadowy teacher energy or expression, there is this tendency to self promote. And although that may not be consciously intended at the time of that expression, on a subconscious or unconscious level, that desire, so to speak, of the self being acknowledged is what's coming through, is being expressed nonetheless. And I feel like I'm getting off on a little bit of, like, this is really abstract. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not relevant. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not salient. And that doesn't mean that there isn't value. There isn't intrinsic value in this information. It's just that the information, as it's being expressed, feels very challenging to articulate because of its rather abstract nature. But there is some correlation here between this shadowy, and by shadowy I just mean rather hidden, rather unacknowledged, rather unseen. There's a presence that is not within the conscious awareness. And it's that energy that may be expressing, even though there isn't that conscious awareness that may be happening. There is a correlation here between the sort of self-promotional, the unconscious or subconscious self-promotional aspect of that shadowy teacher energy referenced in the prior video, with this exploration into the experience of the Riverfest, and how that same sort of unseen energy is speaking the loudest. And that's what I seem to be attempting to articulate, as clumsily as sometimes I feel like it's very clumsy, and then at other times I feel like it's very coherent. So they both can exist simultaneously. honestly, this just what I'm saying right now kind of feels like a downer. And I kind of feel like, as celebratory as it is intended to be, it's just not there. It's just that desperation. It reeks of desperation to me. Desperation for people to come out and support businesses, desperation for money to flow into the city, desperation for positive public recognition, for positive public like media coverage. And it's just jamming this desperation, like pounding it so hard, forcing it so hard. And that's what I feel like I'm sensing. That's what I feel like I'm experiencing in this. And that overshadows the the inherent beauty of the experience, the inherent collective engagement, belonging, that already exists, that is ripe for acknowledgement already. And it doesn't need to be forced. You know, anyway, okay. It's interesting because I'm noticing an expression here about desperation as sort of two distinct experiences of it. So there's an experience of desperation from a sense of kind of that organic gravitation to community. Desperation because there is a deeper knowing of that inherent experience already existing. So to say that there is a desperateness for what one knows to already be true and existing, so to speak. It's almost, to use the carrot example, having a carrot in front of you. I forget exactly how the phrase goes, but there's this desperation because towards the carrot, and you're desperate to obtain this carrot that's in front of you. You see the carrot, you are consciously aware of the existence of this carrot, and you are consciously aware of your desire to obtain that carrot, so to speak. So there is a desperation out of this awareness of this thing that is desired. You know that the carrot exists. You know that what it is that you desire exists and it's within reach. So there's that sense of desperation from a place of inherent sort of deep knowing of the existence of that which is desired. And then there's also this sort of correlated yet distinct experience of desperation in terms of desperation to appear successful. In this carrot example, it's almost like desperation of whoever placed the carrot in such a way. There's a desperation to control the behavior, the actions, the thoughts, the desires, so to speak, of the horse or donkey or whatever that is now wanting this carrot. It's that sense of desperation that also seems to be expressing here. So it's these multi-dimensional awareness of the experience of desperation. Uh, uh. No, I don't really feel much of anything about it, honestly. I really don't. It feels just like empty. In a way, I feel so deeply disconnected. To bring together the community, to form connections, I don't feel any of that through these events. I mean, I guess maybe to a degree I do. I mean, I do enjoy the farmers market to some extent. I enjoy that I'm happy that it exists, but I don't rely on it. I don't seem to feel any sort of like, oh, okay, because this exists, that means that I have a sense of community. I'm going to rely on this as my sense of community. Whatever. I don't fucking know what I'm saying. So it's just so strategized. The article about the new president at Russell Sage really highlighted this by I think it was a quote of his that he said something along the lines of how it's all about getting, and this goes to, okay, so this is really interesting because this goes toward how I have felt about the importance of eyeballs for the YouTube videos. What he was talking about was the importance of hiking up student enrollment. Now, here, businesses that are members of the bid can sign up for navigator cards to assign to employees. So that right there, businesses that are members of the bid. So this is already predominantly speaking toward membership of the bid. This just to me stands out as a promotional ad to become a member of the bid, to increase the membership of the bid. So it's a partnership that increases the membership of the bid and increases the participation in the CDTA transit service. I'm not saying these are inherently bad or wrong, that the services in and of themselves are bad. It's just that this focus on membership, focus on numbers of the sort of numerical participation, that focus is reminding me of the tendency to focus on followers, the tendency to focus on subscribers. And there's something about it to me that is just really standing out, really an invitation to shift the focus. Again, not because it's inherently wrong and not inherently bad. Sure, you can attach that label, but it's not about that either. It doesn't feel like it's about attaching these labels, but more so about the acknowledgement that it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be a priority. And with it not being a priority, that doesn't necessarily mean that the fundamental purpose of the service being provided is going to quote unquote fail. It doesn't mean that the service is not going to, can't be of excellent quality, so to speak. It doesn't have to mean any of that. And so I question, why is it so important to continue to focus on these numbers as the drivers? Oh, we have to get more membership. We have to get more followers. We have to get more subscribers because that means that is the measurement of success, quote unquote. That is the measurement of success. So I guess in a way, this is really highlighting how it's obvious in a way, like, yes, this is how we measure, this is how culturally we have tended to measure success, is through numbers, through this sort of tangible, somewhat easily accessible for the mental body. For the mental body, it's easily accessible. It's an easily accessible reference point to reflect on the impact, the influence, so to speak, of a service. And a lot of that is largely what not even starting, but what is feeling hollow, what is feeling almost non-substantive, which is somewhat ironic because there is so much focus on these numbers as substantive, as having substantive meaning, and yet there is this non-substantial feeling or like non-substantive feeling that perhaps is what was trying to come through, what was trying to express in what I was just referencing in terms of the recent River Fest, where perhaps that's a lot of why it feels desperate, because there is a feeling of desperation in the air around it, in driving up numbers and driving up foot traffic and driving up participation. Yes, because there is a genuine, deeply felt desire for belonging and for collective togetherness, that collective connection, that intimate sort of collective connection that exists, that's there, but it's overwhelmed and sort of overshadowed by this desperation for feet and for the exchange of financial resources in a numerical sense, less so in an energetic sense, in that flow, in that energetic flow of giving and receiving in a sovereign embodiment. But when I read articles that quote only the leadership of an organization, okay, so this is where I start to kind of go into a little bit of a bit of a different flow. Both experiences of desperation are valid. They are real within the reality being experienced by those engaging in them, so to speak. There is this tendency to rely on, I was talking about reliance a bit, of the label, the experience, relying on the experience as community, as what is perceived as community, what is experienced as community. So, sort of projecting that known desire, so to speak, projecting that known desire within oneself outward onto the experience, attaching that desire to the experience. And so perceiving only the experience in connection with the label of community. Oh, this is community. The invitation here is perhaps to sort of perceive the experience not as the thing in and of itself, not as community in and of itself, but to look at the experience, to perceive the experience as a point of reflection on the desire for community, the desire for the experience of community, what it is to be in community, what community means within oneself. Once I have looked at external experiences more as reflection points to inquire within myself, there's sort of a detachment. It's not that the desire for community evaporates, it's more that the desire remains. The desire, if anything, is enhanced and strengthened, but the attachment to specific experiences labeled as community doesn't necessarily, like I start to become aware of the disconnection that I feel, the discordance that I feel between that inner desire and the sort of external experience thereof. Again, that doesn't mean that the experience and desire for community doesn't exist. It becomes more real without also quoting the community members, so to speak, that the leadership is referencing. It falls a little flat. So this quote here, the bid needs to be more of a resource for our businesses, and we thought this was a good way to be that resource. That's great. I'm curious to hear what the businesses have to say. Have the businesses come forth to the bid of their own accord? Is it the businesses that have come forth because they see an opportunity that feels right to them, that they propose to the bid, and the bid is taking action on that? Because the way that this is articulated, it feels to me, or it appears to me, more as this is what we think is good for the businesses, therefore I don't know, it just has a tendency of feeling a bit one-sided, a bit misleading, perhaps. But then again, I'm not consciously aware of the communications between the businesses and the bid. Yeah, see, I'd be interested to know how many businesses and what businesses actually request these cards. And not only what businesses request them, but it'd be interesting to also know how the employees of those businesses feel, what the perspective is of the employees of these businesses who request it and who don't request it, and what kind of system is in place for that communication between employees, amongst employees, the leadership of the businesses, like what kind of communication is had around this. There is this tendency also to couch it in terms, in phrases, in narratives that are relatively easy sort of for people to jump on board with and not really question. It's a really deep inquiry into one's transparency with themselves, because this fixation on the participatory nature of service, it can become very imbalanced. And see, there's something else here. I'm not quite sure how to the transition from the previous segment to this. There's like not really continuity at all. I was getting into this discussion and I had to like really reflect back on this particular segment and ask myself, where was this coming from? Because it really feels very disjointed. It feels really incongruous to the previous segment. And in digging a bit into where I was coming from, I realized, or I recalled that I had been sort of midstream, and this was actually an attempt to not divert myself. It was an attempt to remain in the flow of a stream of conscious contemplation whilst simultaneously taking action to capture that stream, or the experience of that stream. So it feels a bit, in the transition between the two segments, it feels a bit disjointed. that's okay. And so this flow was coming through because at the time, and I believe I get into this a little bit, but just to preface it a bit more, for that continuity, perhaps this, post-recording editing phase is the opening for that continuity. So the stream that I was in at the time came through because prior to the recording, I had been feeling this discomfort in the motivation to record at all. The motivation being twofold, and I definitely get into this in the video, and discerning between those motivations felt uncomfortable. It felt unclear. And so sitting in that energy and expressing it is what led me into this articulation that's being recorded. And in as much as there is this tendency to fixate on numbers, this fixation of participation, measurement of participation, there it can also be this tendency to fixate on being of service to that participation. I have seen so many people, myself included, I've seen so many people burn out in this fixation to be of service to the participation. So I sort of question, how do you tell the difference? How do you discern between the genuine gravitation in a particular direction that happens to be of service in a greater sense than yourself, and this sort of a bit subtle fixation on that participatory nature, whether it's in accumulating membership, participation, and or it's in fixating on being of service to that participation. This sort of also speaks toward what I was talking about in the previous segment regarding Riverfest. What I had commented on in the previous segment was this twofold experience of desperation. So it's interesting now how there's this experience, the experience of Riverfest, and there's a multi-dimensional aspect of desperation that comes through, and there is a multi-dimensional experience of motivation that comes through. And they all sort of speak towards the same thing. This inquiry arose because I've been feeling this very subtle desire to get back in the ring, so to speak, to continue posting regularly, to post again sooner rather than later. And I was noticing how, interestingly, there seems to be, perhaps, there is this YouTube organism that is alive and has an energy of its own, so to speak. Anyway, okay. This Gemini, okay, the sun in Gemini right now is like scatterbrain central. Prior to really posting on YouTube, even with the Substack, I hadn't really been feeling this sort of subtle fixation as much as I do now. And I started questioning, well, first of all, seeing YouTube as this sort of living organism that perhaps I was being informed by. And then I started inquiring into the feeling I had around this fixation, or this fixated sort of feeling, and wondering, well, I do have this natural sort of gravitation that is passionate about this direction, and or just where I am in the present moment, and continuing to engage with life, with reality, so to speak, as I have been. So that hasn't changed. However, I wonder, is this, like, where is it feels like such a fine line between that passion, at least at the moment, this current moment, it feels like a fine line between that sense of genuine engagement in reality and this rather subtle fixation on the participatory nature of it, at least the possible potentiality of participation in it. Yeah, so that fixation, that tendency to fixate on the participatory nature, is again that kind of like externalized projection. So there's a projection onto an externalized experience as that which sort of defines my perception of success, or my experience of success, my experience of myself, even. And there is always that kind of informative process unfolding and emerging. However, it's when that projected fixation is how I identify as successful, how I identify as heard, how I identify as belonging and safe and secure. And it's in externalizing and projecting those experiences of oneself, those sensations, those values, projecting them onto an experience that appears in that moment as separate, and in that identified with, oh, that means that I'm successful if this, that means that I'm in community if this. It's that kind of informing that feels rather hollow to me, that feels rather unsubstantial. There's a lack of intimate connection, and perhaps a lot of that is because in disconnecting the perception of safety and security and belonging and community, disconnecting those experiences of oneself from an attachment to an externalized experience and bringing it back to myself, grounding it within the experience of myself, in and of myself, that shifts. I lost my train of thought. Yes, I have a banana. I don't know why that just like struck my attention the way that it did. Potassium.
And it's part 3 of the ABA's 6-part series, AI in the Legal Profession, Navigating Opportunities and Challenges. From the predictive analytics perspective, we're looking at, can we predict?
I just want to say real quick that what's coming through with what he just said is there's a question here around how we relate to privacy, how we relate to ownership, and this has been something that's been coming up a lot lately in contemplation, but just generally, how do we relate to the sense of privacy? How do we relate to the sense of ownership of information? And there's interesting, I know I've used this phrase before, but it's like there's ripe ground there for exploring that relationship and on a very deep level what privacy means, what ownership means, sort of in a very impersonal way when you take yourself out of it. How does this want to express? It's almost as though there's a different relationship to privacy and ownership and other values, so to speak. There's a different relationship when there is a personal, when the relationship is looked through the personal lens and when the relationship is looked through the impersonal lens. And it's not as though one is more valid than the other. You know, so much of how the law is created and how much the sort of framework for looking or relating to these values is structured is from the personal lens, from the lens of the egoic sense of self has an intimate attachment to, or I suppose identifies, the egoic sense of self identifies with what it considers private. What's interesting when leaning into the aspect of being that doesn't identify with its experiences as personal experiences per se, it sort of transcends that identification with those experiences. When leaning into that more expansive awareness, there doesn't seem to be, at least in, I'm going to say personal experience, but at least in the subjective experience here, what I've observed is that in that awareness, there isn't much attachment to privacy. There isn't as much attachment to ownership as an identification of the self. So it's more fluid, it's more boundless, and in that conception of privacy, the conception of ownership doesn't hold as much significance in the in the experience of safety, in the experience of security, in the experience of liberation.
Thanks, Cody. And thank you, James, for having us here. It's always a great opportunity to talk about our work. I don't think you could find three people.
I've had this analogy the last 2 weeks or so. There's multiple layers of the skin. I don't know offhand the exact language except epidermis, I believe. But there is the sort of initial top layer of the skin that comes into contact with the sun's rays. And what's interesting is I was thinking one day, what if the top layer of the skin sort of identified with those rays, sort of related to those sun rays in a way that said those rays are mine. Maybe this isn't the best analogy here. I guess what I'm getting at is it's interesting to think about what happens when there is a perception and there is an embodied presence, there is an embodied centered sense of self that doesn't identify with personal data, just for lack of a better phrase. It doesn't relate to, we'll just say, information correlated with that self. So there's information related to the self, but that embodied sense of self doesn't relate to that information in a way that feels a quote unquote need to privatize it. There is a relationship of neutrality in the sense of it's information. It's information that I don't have to identify the sense of self with to feel safe and secure and trusting. What happens when the embodied sense of self feels neutral toward the data generated through that sense of self?